All right, so in this video, we're going to put into practice some of the things related to CSS Grid and CSS Flexbox. We're going to code out this wireframe that we see here on the left. In the right here, I've already kind of created a skeleton for this profile page. And so I have some CSS that I'm bringing in from an external file. If you look at the folder structure here, the overall project folder is mpls_agent. So there's going to be an agent profile page that we'll be coding out here. So I have a CSS file that has a bunch of external CSS code that gives some of the look and feel of this document. And so there, let me go ahead and save this here. You can actually see the rendered output. Give me 1 second here. So this is what we have thus far. So we're not going to start from scratch. We're going to start with this here, and then we're going to begin to populate some of the code that will go in between the header, in this case, this banner section, and this logo. So everything that we're going to basically provide some more structure to what's going to go between this header and this graphic here of where apartments make you an offer. And so looking back here, we're going to code out the navigation. We're going to code out this overview section, this prospective renters, and then that'll be it. But we're going to use CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid to give structure to these various components. All right, so when observing this wireframe here, we have this banner section, and here we're just basically using traditional float. And so I'm going to scroll down and just say a few words about this top banner section here. So everything that I have highlighted on the right hand side here in my editor is referring to this banner section in my wireframe. And so we have this div ID equals profile top section, and we have two child elements nested. Essentially what we've done here, we've taken this P element. These is basically within a normal flow. The P is stacked on top of the section, and then we float text align right for the paragraph tag within the top profile top section. And then this area here is this margin auto. We gave it a width, and we centered everything that shows up in this profile top section. Also, this profile top section has a background image that we've put in the background here, and that's that couch. Kind of the living room image that you see there in the background. So like I said, that was nothing but traditional float. And you can look at the CSS at the top here. So profile top section. And then here's kind of the information that I use to structure out this top section of our website. Again, we have a footer at the bottom here. And that's going to be the static footer that goes across, that's going to be basically placed on every document or every page on my website. So I just added that footer in there. But the main part that I'm concerned about is going to be this section here, where we're going to basically code out the navigation, the overview section, and then the prospective renters. So let's go and take a stab at that here. So I already have a container within my code called profile grid container. And then this section here is going to take, if you look at here, we're going to have 4 rows, all right? I'm sorry, 4 columns, 1, 2, 3, 4, as I kind of laid it out in my wireframe. And then here I'm going to have 3 rows. One row is going to be for my navigation. The second row is going to be my overview section. And the third row is going to be my prospective renters. And so here, my profile grid container, if we were to go back to our PowerPoint, let's bring that up. We're going to start with grid. And the first thing you do when you start with grid is that you define a container and you put display grid, and then you set the column, you set the number of columns, and you set the number of rows. So we've already predetermined that we need 4 columns and then 3 rows. So here I'm going to create a style rule for a profile grid container, which I've already done. It's an ID attribute. So if I go up, here's my style rule. And the first thing I'm going to do is put in display grid. Right, that's the first step. And we're going to set the number of columns and rows. And so if I look back here, right, if you go to the next slide here, it talks about how to set the number of columns and rows. I want to use these 2 properties here, grid template columns, grid template rows. I'll copy it, and I'll just paste it in here. And remember, I can say that my columns here are going to be a certain width, but in this case here, I'm going to have 4 columns, and I'm going to use this repeat function. The first argument that I'll put is 4. I'm going to have 4 columns, and then 1 fraction of the space. And so it's going to take up equal portion of the available space that's permitted. Now, I am going to set a width to my container because everything in my container is going to be centered, and I'm going to do a margin auto. So I'll just say that my width is going to be, let's start off with 85%, and then we'll say margin auto. And why we did that here is because we don't want it to go to the edge, right? Everything is going to be within these 4 columns, but there's going to be some active white space to the right and to the left. And then auto is what centers our website. The rows, we're going to have 3 rows. And our 3 rows here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a different function here. Not a function, what I'm going to do is specify 3 different rows. I'm going to say the first row is going to be 100 pixels. Second row is going to be 2 FR, and then the last one is going to be 3 FR. And then here I'm going to also set a height, and I'll make the height, let's see here, 100. Let's just start off by saying 700 or 800, 900 pixels. And we will eventually change the height. One of the things that I didn't mention at this point, but when you're doing page layout, give every box element a border so you can actually see the boxes taking shape. And so here I'm going to give my container a border. Now to say 2 pixels, solid, green. And I just want to see the area that I'm working with in the various boxes and how they're taking shape. So again, whenever you're doing page layout, make sure you give your box elements a border, every box element a border, so you can actually see the box elements taking shape. You can give it a background color, or you can give it a box shadow, whatever your preference is. You can just make sure that you can see the box elements taking shape here. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to render this in the browser just to make sure that I have that area designated. So here's my grid area. The container is defined. And like I said, I have a default height of 900 pixels at this point. I'll eventually take off the 900 pixels because the box elements will automatically populate the height of this here. But if I were to right click and inspect, you'll see that my grid is now defined, right? I have 4 columns and then 3 rows within this grid. And then also we have the margin auto, and our site is centered within the browser. Now I'm going to take this up to 90% just so that I can have a little bit more space. And like I said, I'll begin to change some of these values as we go forward. But nonetheless, like I said, I have some arbitrary values in here just so I can begin to fill out the space and understand kind of some of the different fill out the space, but also understand some of the how my site is taking shape here. So let's go back to our source code and begin to flush out the items in our grid. I'm going to change this to 90%. And I'll save it. Now, the next thing here is I want to begin to place items into the grid. But first I need to define the HTML of the items that I'll place into the grid. And so in this case, I'm going to have 3 items I'll place into the grid. And like I said, there's different approaches to doing page layout. I like to use the grid just to kind of give definition. I don't necessarily need to use a grid at this point, but I want to use a grid to kind of give overall structure to how the items will be placed into my site. And so that's going to actually begin to code out the HTML for our first part here, which is going to be our navigation. And what I'm going to do here is I'm not going to get into the details of the inner box element. So I'm not going to put in the 7 active prospects, 12 scheduled tours or favorites. Well, what I will do is just show you the outer box elements. And I want to make sure that my site is taking shape according to the way that I intend for it to. And then later on, I'll begin to flush out the inner box elements and add text and add the color and add a little bit more finesse to the site. But at this point, I'm just concerned about making sure that the box elements will be displayed. And so you'll see that I'll focus only on the navigation in these 3 box elements. And then I'll focus only on the overview and the prospective renters. but only on the outer box elements, not necessarily focusing on the innermost box elements. So let's take a look at this here and begin to code this out. All right, so let's go ahead and provide the structure here. So for this first part here, I'm going to go on line number 93, and I'm going to create a nav. And I'll give it an ID equals profile nav. And within my profile nav, I'm going to have a logo, which is going to be the site logo. And I'll just give that profile logo. And I need to give the actual image, img, and then source equals, and I'll come back and populate the image, but then alt would just be equal to MPLS renders logo. And then also here, I'm going to have within my navigation, I have the logo, right? That's going to be on the far left, and I'm going to have 3 links. And so what I'll do here is I'll just create some ahrefs so I can hyperlink to the various resources or areas within my page. So I'll just say href, and this would be my favorites. This is going to be offer lists. And this one will be profile settings. And then also I have this notification bell here. And so I'll go ahead and do a div here. Give it an ID of notification, and I have an img image that's going to serve that space. I have a source attribute, and right now I don't have the file path. I do have some images here located that I'll begin to populate for the logo and the notification, but we'll come back and do that. And then alt tag is going to be equal to notification symbol. And my div is closed. And so that's the HTML for my nav that I'll have here. Then the next grid item that I'll place is going to be this overview section. So I'll just say, in this case here, I know I'm going to have an H1 within this overview section. And so I'm going to use a section tag. And I'll just use a H2 for now, or not an H1, but a heading tag. And I'll just say overview, or let's use a H3. And I'm also going to have another section here, which is going to be, I'll use a div tag that's going to give structure to these 3 box elements. And this will be very similar to the first activities that we've done here. I'm going to create 3 outer box elements, and I'll use Flexbox in this area. But overall, the section here is going to be considered, I'll give it an ID equals overview, agent overview. Div ID equals, and I'll just call this agent, or let's do class. Agent stat box. And I'm gonna have 3 of those stat boxes here. So let's copy that. Copy. Now paste. All right. And like I said, at this moment, I'm only focused on the outer box elements, but there's going to be more inner box elements. So I could go in and put like H2 to represent the 7, right? The structure, or capture the data that's going to be within the boxes. But at this point, I'm only concerned about just the overall structure of our site. And so I'll give a border that would outline each of these box elements. The next section here is going to be this perspective renders. And like I said, I'm going to have 3 grid items, right? It's going to be the nav, the section, and then I'll also have this section here, which is going to be perspective renders. section. So I'll just also say section ID equals, and I'll say agent underscore prospective renter. It's going to be a very long ID info. And here I'm going to have an H3, which is going to be prospective renter. And then I'll have this section here. And like I said, right now, I'm only concerned about the outer box element. So I'll say div ID equals agent prospective data. And like I said, there'll be more. I'll use grid to give structure to some of the information that's within this box element. But at this moment here, so I'll just put a comment here, grid to structure out the display of data. But we'll come back later and fill out that information. So at this moment, everything is coded in terms of these three sections. So here's my first grid item, which is going to be the navigation. My second grid item is going to be the overview. And my third grid item is going to be the prospective renters. And that's all captured here between lines 91 and 113. And so what we're going to do now is begin to add some CSS, and we'll start with we'll add some CSS and place these items into the grid. And we're going to use grid lines. And so if you remember from our lecture, there's a couple different ways you can actually place these items onto the grid. So we defined our grid, but now we need to place these items into our grid. And we're going to use line numbers to place these grid items onto the grid. Now we could also use area names, where we could have gave every particular grid item a name by saying grid area and give it a name. But I want to demonstrate this within this example using line numbers. So let's take a look at adding some CSS to this, and then we'll conclude the video. So let's save it and let's add some CSS. I'm going to add the CSS internally here. Let me save my work, and we'll go up, and what I'm going to do here is create some space and within our internal CSS and begin to target the first grid item is our nav that we want to place into the grid. So that's going to do that here. All right, so that's going to target our profile nav, and so we're going to create an ID attribute and say pound profile nav underscore. And again, the first thing you want to do is create a border. So we'll say border. We'll say 2 pixels solid, and we'll just say this yellow green here border. So we can actually see the box element taking shape. What we're going to do here, we're going to place the profile nav onto the grid. But before we do that, let's going to give some structure to this box element before we place it. And so what we're going to do here is let's go ahead and, well, let's go ahead and place it onto the grid, and then we'll give it some structure. So remember, if we look back at our PowerPoint, we're going to use these properties here called, let's go back to the line numbers. We're going to say grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, or you can use grid column or grid row. That's if you only spanning one particular column or one row. But because we're going to be spanning multiple columns, we're going to use these set of properties here that I have highlighted. And so let's jump back to our code. And what I'm going to do here is say grid column start. And my grid column start is going to be, if I were to use these columns here, you would count the lines. And so it's going to start at line number 1. Grid column in. It's going to be, I can say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or I can just say -1 because I can also do the reciprocal. So in this case here, I'll just say -1, which is going to always be the last line within the grid. And then here, I'll say grid row start It's going to start at the very first row, so that'll be 1, and grid row in, which is going to be 2, 1, 2. And you may be saying, what am I referring to here? If I go back to my layout here, if I hover over the grid container, right? Let's do this here. So here is my grid, and I want my navigation to show up and span all 4 columns of where my mouse is hovering. And so what I have here is that my grid row starts on 1, and I only want to go to the second one. So grid row start, it would be 1, grid row end would be 2, grid column start would be 1, and then I automatically know that this is also a -1, so I can say either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can say 5, or I can say -1 because it's -1, -2, -3, -4, -5 if you go the opposite direction. So jumping back to my code here, grid row in would be 2. So let's go ahead and give this a height and say min height. And what min height is saying is that this is the minimum height of the available space that it can go. You can't go below 100 pixels. Let's save that and let's see how it's placed into our grid here. So if we save this here and go back and refresh, we'll see that now we have our nav. I probably should change this to a different color here. Profile nav, change that to like an orange or some type of purple, right? And you'll see that now that's been placed into our grid. So if we were to right click and inspect our grid, there's our navigation, right? That's in blue. So let's continue to place the other items into our grid. And like I said, we're not necessarily concerned about the innermost box elements at this point. We're just more so concerned about the outer box elements. So let's go ahead and place these other items onto our grid here. The next one we're going to place onto the grid is going to be the agent overview section of our site. And then we'll come back and begin to populate some of the inner box elements. But let's first place all of the grid items into our outer grid, our profile grid container. So here, agent overview, we're going to create a style rule for that. So we'll say pound agent underscore overview, open bracket, close bracket. First thing we want to do is give it a border, 2 pixels, solid, and then we just say purple for this one. And we're going to do the grid column start. I'll just go ahead and copy these here for the sake of time. The grid column start is going to be 1, and for the most part, each of my sections, grid items, are going to span all 4 columns, and so this will be the case for each one of my 3 grid items. But the grid row start here will be, in this case, will be 2, and we'll end on 3, and that'll get my agent overview. And the last one, let's do the perspective render section here. So we'll say pound agent perspective render underscore info. And here again, we're going to copy these here. We're going to add a border first. So border, 2 pixels, solid, and let's just do blue. And we're going to paste in those properties here. It's going to be 1, -1, because it's going to span all 4 columns. But then the row is going to be 3, and we're going to end at row 4. So we'll save that, and then let's go back to our web page and just see how these items are placed into the grid. Right, and that's what we're looking for here, right? So we have our navigation, our overview section, and our perspective render. and those items are now placed onto our grid. So if we were to right click and inspect and then look at the grid, you'll see that each one of those items are now properly placed onto our grid, and that's what we're looking for. Now our job here is to begin to structure out the inner box elements for each of these different sections. So right now it's kind of in a normal flow where you have the logo stacking on top of the various links and the notification symbol, but we want to use the span the width of the navigation. And we got some 3 different stat boxes that we need to structure out, and we have another box element that we need basically for the profile render information. So let's go ahead and capture some of that information in this video and continue to flush out the details of this layout. All right, so for our navigation, our profile navigation, which is a grid item, what we're going to do is we're going to turn this profile nav into a flex container, right? So even though it's a grid item, we are going to implement Flexbox into it, because we're going to make sure that each one of these items, the logo, the favorites, the offer list, the profile settings, that those are going to be they're going to be considered flex items. So this brings about a good question. Can you have Flexbox and CSS grid implemented into one page layout? Yes, you can. So the first thing I'm going to do here, I'm just going to put display. How do you implement Flexbox? You put display and you say flex. And then the next thing is going to be to, that's going to basically make each one of these child items a flex item. And so here, profile logo, then these 3 A tags, and then the notification, they're all considered flex items. What we're going to do now here, if I were to save this and show you what happened, you won't see much, but you'll see that now they're all in a horizontal line. So if I go back to the page here and run this in the browser and refresh, you'll see that now they're, instead of being stacked on top of one another, they're horizontal. What I want to do is give each one of these elements a border so we can actually see the box elements taking shape. So what I'm going to do here is go back to my source code, and I'm going to create some new style rules here that will target each of the child elements within the profile nav. So I'll say pound. I'm going to use something called descendant selector, and I want to target the profile logo, and I'll give a border, and I'll just give them all the 2 pixel solid red. And then the next one is going to be the A tags. So I'll say pound profile underscore nav A. Again, give it a border. And again, why am I giving this a border? And so that I can actually see the box elements taking shape. And the next one is going to be this notification. And these descendant selectors are saying that target only these elements that are children of the profile nav. So profile nav, and then pound, and it's going to be the notification. All right, so if I save this here and I refresh, you'll see that now each one of these box elements have a red logo around them. I'm sorry, a red border around them. And at this point here is that I've already given some properties to the container. So now I want to actually begin to give some definition to the individual flex items, because the logo, the 3 link A tags, and the notification symbols are now considered flex items. So let's go ahead and give some properties to our flex items. And if you remember, go ahead and use this guide. It's going to help you. So all the properties on the left here are pertaining to the actual container, and then all the properties on the right hand side here are pertaining to the children. So what I want to do here is I want to give what we call flex grow, flex shrink, and then flex basis to each one of my child items. So let me minimize this here, and I'm going to first give that to my logo. I'll say flex, and it's going to be flex grow is going to be 1. The flex shrink is going to be 0, and the flex basis it can't, basically this box element can't get smaller than a particular measurement unit. In this case here, I'm going to say it can't get smaller than 150 pixels. And then for my A tags here, I'll say flex 1, 0, and I'll say that it can't get smaller than 100 pixels. And my notification, flex 1, 0, and I'll say 50 pixels. So watch what happens now when I save this and I refresh. So I'll go back to my the rendered output of this, and if I refresh, look what happens here. And Flexbox automatically does the calculation to get these box elements to take shape or to fill the available space. And that's one of the beautiful things about Flexbox, is that it's going to automatically do the calculations to basically span the available space within the container. I want this text, my A tags, to be centered within the browser. So I'll right click and I'll inspect. And I'll just prototype this in the browser, and I'll just say text align, and I'll just say center. All right. I'm okay with my logo being left aligned and my notification symbol being left aligned at this moment. And so let's go ahead and center that, and then also let's add some padding. So padding, and that's the active white space inside of the box element. Let's say 3%. Or let's say 2%. Okay. And then also we'll increase the font size to 2 EM or to about 1.7 EM. So let's do 1.5 EM. All right. So here I like the look and feel of that. So what I'm going to do here is just copy these properties, and I'll add that to my style rule for profile nav _A. So I'll go back into my code and I'll just paste in those declarations. Again, I'm using Flexbox here to implement some of those things here. And then, like I said, I'll add in a logo for my MPLS renders logo and my notification symbol. But hopefully you'll see the steps I took to begin to give structure to this header section. Let's go to the overview section here. I know this video is getting quite long, and so let's go ahead and go to the overview section. Let's add in, we're going to also use Flexbox in this overview section, and then the bottom section here we'll use grid. But let's move on to this overview section now. Let's go back to our source code, and let's target and create some style rules here for the overview section. So let's first implement Flexbox, make this a Flex container. So this section ID agent overview, let's make it a Flex container. The way to do that is put display Flex, and we're going to create some style rules here for the child items, which is going to be the H3 and then these 3 stat boxes. So we're going to essentially have 2 style rules, one for the H3 and then one for one style rule that's going to target all the agent stat boxes. So here, what I'm going to do now is use the descendant selector here. I'll say pound agent overview and only target the H3, that's a child of the agent overview. And then also I'll create another style rule that says agent _ overview and target only the class that's a child of the agent overview dot stat box. And then here we'll begin to add some declarations to get this to structure out. All right, so here's our agent overview H3, and then here's our agent stat boxes. And what that's going to look like here is what we see here. Overview is going to take up all 4 columns, and then we have our stat boxes. But again, I'm going to use Flexbox to give structure to this whole entire section. We've already placed this section on the grid. So now let's target each of the various flex items. And so here what we're going to do is we're going to say flex. We're going to give it a flex basis of 1, a flex shrink of 0, and we'll give it a flex basis of 100% because we want this to always be 100% of the available space. And we'll also give it a border so we can actually see it. So we'll say 2 pixels solid, and then we'll say yellow. The next thing here is let's go ahead and give this a height. And we'll just say a height of 75 or 90 pixels, or min height. Let's save that, and the next flex boxes here that we'll work with are going to be these boxes here. Now, I want to introduce a new property here. Well, it's not new. I've talked about this in previous videos here, but it's going to be something called flex wrap. And I want these to wrap to the next line because my overview is going to take up the full line, but then my other 3 boxes are going to wrap to the next line, and it's going to be immediately underneath the overview box. And so flex wrap, we're going to say wrap, and that's on the container. And then for each of my flex items, I'm going to say for each of my stat boxes here, I'll give it a flex of 1, 0. And let's just start off with each box taking up 30% of the space. Oh, let's do auto. Let's start off by saying min of 350 pixels. And I could change these values later on. And I'll give it a border so we can actually see them. And we just do orange red for the border. And we'll give each box a height. Let's give it a height of, let's start off with 325 pixels. And let's give some margin. And we'll say margin of 10 or 3% around each box item, or 2. And we'll also, well, yeah, it works. Instead of a border here, let's do a box shadow. And we'll just say 5 pixels, 5 pixels, 10 pixels, and then do a dark gray. And we'll save it. So now let's save this and see what we have. And so we'll save it, and let's go to our web page. And this is our overview section, and let's refresh. And so here's my overview, but then you have the 3 box elements that are taking shape, and I'm using Flexbox to give structure to these elements here. All right. In the last section here, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use grid to give structure to the items that you see here in this section of my site. So what I'm going to do here, I'm not going to go in and implement the full grid here. This video is getting close to 38 minutes here, but it is permissible to have grid nested within grid. So you can have multiple grids nested within an overall grid. And that's kind of what I'm going to do here with this prospective renter section. But hopefully you get the idea of how the approach that I'm taking to lay out this web page. And like I said, it doesn't look quite like our wireframe at this moment, because right now I'm only focusing on the outer box elements. And I'll come back and begin to finesse the layout of this site to get it to look exactly like my wireframe. But more so, I'm focused on giving the overall structure of my layout. So let's focus on this last section here, and then we'll end this video here. So let's go back to our code here, and what we're going to do here is take a look at adding this section, this prospective renters section to our site. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to implement grid in this area. Oops. And what I'm going to do is give it a container. So I'll say div ID equals prospective renter. Well, let's just give it grid renter info. Let's keep it short. So whenever you're doing Flexbox or grid, you have to give it a container. And then within my container here, I'm going to have two rows. One row is going to be the prospective renters. And then my second row is going to be, I'm sorry, let's actually do Flexbox here. Not Flexbox, but let's do, yeah, we'll do grid. Sorry about that. I'm going to have two different columns here. One is going to be the overall column. It's going to be my grid container. So I'll actually go back and undo what I did here. Yep. So here's what I have, the grid renters info. And then within the grid renter info, I'm going to have two child items here, or three child items. I'm going to have, let's do section. And it's going to be the prospective renters info section, which is going to take up two columns. Preferred move-in section, and then the options section, which is going to take up one column here. So I'll say section, and I'll say ID equals info. Another section here. I'll say ID equals info move in. And then my last one is going to be options. Okay. And I remember I have to go and define my grid. So I'm going to go create a style rule here for the grid renter info. So I'll go back up, and here I'm going to put a comment in my CSS and say grid renter info. And I'll begin to create a style rule that will define that information. So I'll say pound grid renter info, open bracket, close bracket. And I'll say display, and I'm going to put grid as the value. And then here I'll go in and then define the number of columns and the number of rows. In this case here, I'm going to have 4 columns. And so it'll be grid template columns. And I'll just have 4. And so I'm going to use a repeat function. The first one is going to be 4, 1FR. And you'll see that that's very similar to what I did here for the overall grid of this web page, which is here for the profile grid container. But then the rows, I am going to say grid template rows, and I'm going to have essentially 2 rows. One that's going to hold the header information, and then, well, actually I'm just going to have 1 row. So I'll just have 1 row here. So it'll be just, and that row is going to be 1FR of the available space. But then here for my grid, I'm going to put a border so we can actually see it. 2 pixels solid, and I'll make this let's go ahead and choose gray. Oops. And then so we have the gray border, and then also let's go and give this a temporary height, and say 400 pixels, or let's give it, 400 pixels. So we can actually see it. And then the width is going to be 100% of the available space. And we'll save it here. So now let's go back to our web page and let's actually take a look at what we have here. If we refresh, you'll see that we have this gray area. It's expanding our current container. So what I'm going to do here is now take off the height of my overall container, which is for the grid container. So if you remember, for the profile grid container here, I put a height of 900 pixels, and that was just temporarily, just so I can actually see the box elements. But now I'm going to take that off. I'll save it, and you'll see that now when I go back, this green line should be pretty much at the same, the same as the gray line within my innermost container. So here's that green line, and so we're good to go at this point. And then at this point here is I already have if I right click and I inspect, you'll see that I have a grid set up that has 4 columns, but only 1 row. And that's going to give the overall structure to this profile renters item here. And now I have some other child grid items within this section here as well. So let's go ahead and code out those quickly and add a border so you can actually see the sections taking shape, and then we'll end this video. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back to our code. So here's this, our source code, and then let's bring up our wireframe. All right, so we have the 3 different sections, which is going to be the prospective renter info, the preferred move-in month, and then the options. So that's going to begin to create some style rules for those 3 sections here. So I'm going to then use the descendant selector. So I'll say pound grid renter info space info. My next style rule here that targets the info move in. It's going to be very similar. I'll just copy that. Pound info move in. And then my last one here is going to be info option pound info option, and that's going to target each one of these grid items. So for the first one here, it's going to take up 2 columns. They're all going to be the same row, so I don't necessarily need to I can just essentially use, if we go back to our PowerPoint, because it's only 1 row, I can just essentially use grid row 1 for each one of these here. So each one will have grid row 1. And the other thing we're going to do here is give each one a border. And we'll just say 2 pixels solid, and let's call it red. And let's copy that and place them into each one. And then now we just need to place the items in the respective columns. And so here we'll say grid, and remember we're going to use the line numbers for this, and so we'll use grid column start and grid column end. So we just copy those 2 and place them onto the grid. So grid column start is going to be 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, and the grid column end is going to be 3. We'll do the same thing for our second one, which is going to be the preferred move in. Our grid column start is going to be 1, 2, 3. So it'll start on 3, line number 3, and then it'll end on 4. And then we'll do the same thing here for our last one. So 1, 2, 3, 4. It'll start on 4, and it'll end. We could essentially say -1, which is the last line within our grid. And I'm going to just quickly change the colors here. I'll just call this one blue, and I'll just call this one green so we can actually see it. And then I'm going to also give each one of these a height, and I'll give them the same height. So I would say height of 340 pixels. And I'll just copy each one of those here so we can see the intended height. And I'll save it. So now if we go back to our web page, you'll see that now each of these 3 child items have been placed onto our grid. So let's go into the browser, render our work, or refresh. And there we go, right? So in our perspective renders, we have this red box element. We have this blue, that's going to be the move in. And here it's going to be our move in, our info options section. And so if I not delete this, but kill our Google Chrome Inspect Tools here, our page layout is complete in terms of the overall structure of our site. Now we're going to need to finesse it, add some height, and work with the various inner box elements. But for the most part, the structure of our agent page is done. And you'll see that I've added border to this, to each of the box elements, the outer box elements, so I can actually see the site taking shape. Now there'll be some active white space I need to add. I'll play with the font weight and the height and some of those things. But for the most part, like I said, our page layout is done, and we use the mixture of traditional float along with CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid. Like I said, this can seem somewhat daunting, but once you practice this and you look at and you use these particular these resources here for that's coming from CSS Tricks, and also Flexbox Froggy and CSS Grid Garden, this will begin to make sense, right? But it does require some practice, and always feel free to reach out to me with questions you may have. So I'm going to end this video here. I'm going to continue to flesh this out, and you'll see me add some color. You'll see me add topography into the site, and you'll see the site will begin to look exactly like what you see here within this wireframe. But for the most part, in this video, what I wanted to do was just more so structure out the layout of what you see here. All right, take care.